What happens when a legendary actor's patience runs out on live television? In just 24 seconds, Michael Caine went from composed guest to furious walkout in one of the most shocking exits in Loose Women history. Before we dive into this explosive confrontation, make sure you subscribe to this channel for daily videos exposing Hollywood's darkest scandals. Hit that subscribe button now, because you won't want to miss what happens next. Last night's episode of Loose Women started normally enough. The panel welcomed the iconic Michael Caine onto the set, expecting a pleasant chat about his storied career. The audience applauded warmly as he settled into his seat across from the hosts. Denise Welch, known for her bold, questioning style, led the conversation with her trademark directness. The studio lights were bright, the atmosphere seemed friendly, and everyone in the room expected a typical celebrity interview filled with amusing stories and gentle banter. Michael looked relaxed at first. He wore a sharp navy blue suit with a perfectly pressed white shirt and his famous glasses, sitting comfortably in the guest chair. The other panelists smiled and welcomed him enthusiastically, clearly thrilled to have such a legendary figure on the show. Coffee mugs sat on the table in front of them, steam still rising from the hot drinks. The audience was packed with fans, excited to see the legendary actor in person. Several people in the front row had brought posters and photos they hoped to get signed after the show. Everything about the setup suggested this would be another charming episode of the popular daytime talk show. The warm-up comedian had gotten the audience energized before filming started. People were laughing and chatting amongst themselves. The production assistants were making final checks on the cameras and lighting. The teleprompter was loaded with the planned questions. Everything was running like a well-oiled machine. Nobody in that studio had any idea that they were about to witness television history in the making. The first few minutes went smoothly. They discussed his latest projects, his time in Hollywood, and some of his most famous roles. Michael smiled politely, giving thoughtful answers about his decades in the film industry. He shared a funny story about working with Sean Connery that had the audience laughing loudly. He talked about his favorite films and the directors he most enjoyed collaborating with over the years. He mentioned working with Christopher Nolan and how that experience had been different from his earlier work in the 60s and 70s. The studio audience laughed at his charming anecdotes. Everything seemed perfectly fine on the surface. Denise asked him about his early days in London, and Michael spoke fondly about growing up in South London and how it shaped his approach to acting. He described the struggle of making it in the industry when he was young, facing rejection after rejection. He talked about sleeping on friends' couches and working odd jobs to make ends meet while going to auditions. He mentioned how his mother had supported his dreams even when everyone else thought he was crazy for trying to become an actor. The other panelists nodded sympathetically. One of them mentioned how inspiring his journey was for young actors today. Michael thanked them graciously and said he hoped his story could motivate others to keep pursuing their dreams, no matter how impossible they might seem. He shared another anecdote about his breakthrough role and how he almost didn't get it because the director thought his accent was too thick. The audience was hanging on his every word. This was the Michael Caine they had come to see, the charming storyteller with decades of fascinating experiences. The mood in the studio was warm and engaged. Everyone was enjoying themselves. But then, Denise shifted the conversation in a different direction. She brought up some comments Michael had made years ago about method acting, suggesting that his views were outdated and no longer relevant in modern filmmaking. Michael's expression changed slightly. His smile became tighter. The warmth that had been in his eyes just moments before seemed to cool noticeably. He explained that he simply believed in a different approach to the craft, one that had served him well throughout his entire career, spanning more than 6 decades. He said he respected all forms of acting, but felt that some modern techniques were unnecessarily complicated and sometimes even self-indulgent. Denise pressed harder. She mentioned some younger actors who had criticized his generation's techniques, implying that Michael was stuck in the past and refusing to evolve. She specifically name-dropped a few current Hollywood stars who had spoken publicly about the need for actors to evolve with the times and embrace new methods. She quoted one young actor who had said that old-school acting was dead. The other panelists shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Michael's jaw clenched visibly. He responded that just because something is new doesn't make it better, and that perhaps some people should show more respect for those who paved the way. His voice had taken on an edge that hadn't been there before. He said that without his generation, there would be no film industry for the younger generation to work in. The tension in the studio was becoming obvious. Several audience members stopped smiling and started looking concerned. The cameras captured Michael's changing body language as he sat up straighter in his chair, his relaxed posture replaced with defensive rigidity. Denise leaned forward, her voice taking on a sharper edge. She asked if Michael thought he was above criticism simply because of his age and experience. She suggested that his defensive reaction proved he couldn't handle having his methods questioned. Michael's eyes narrowed. He said that wasn't what he meant at all, but that there's a difference between criticism and disrespect. He emphasized the word disrespect, making it clear he felt the line was being crossed. He said he welcomed thoughtful criticism, but this felt more like an attack designed to provoke him. One of the other panelists tried to lighten the mood by bringing up a funny behind-the-scenes story from one of Michael's films. She started talking about a famous blooper from The Italian Job, but Denise cut her off mid-sentence, determined to continue down this path. She said they were having an important conversation that needed to be had, that they couldn't just skip over difficult topics because they made people uncomfortable. Michael looked at her with growing irritation. He asked what exactly was so important about attacking his methods that had produced dozens of successful films over 60 years. He said his track record spoke for itself and didn't need defending. Then Denise brought up a controversial topic that had been circulating online. She mentioned some old interviews from the 70s and 80s where Michael had made comments that people today found problematic. She brought up specific quotes about women in the film industry and relationships between actors and directors. She asked him directly if he stood by those statements, or if he would apologize for them now. The studio went quiet. You could hear the air conditioning humming in the background. A few people coughed nervously. Michael's face turned red. He said he wasn't going to apologize for speaking his mind decades ago when the world was completely different. His voice was controlled, but you could hear the anger simmering beneath the surface. He said context matters, and that pulling quotes from 40 years ago and judging them by today's standards was fundamentally unfair. Denise wouldn't let it go. She said that just because times were different doesn't excuse harmful attitudes. She suggested that Michael's refusal to acknowledge how his words might have hurt people showed a lack of growth and personal development. She folded her arms across her chest, staring at him expectantly. She said that true growth means admitting when you were wrong. Michael's voice rose. He said he had grown plenty, thank you very much, and that he didn't appreciate being lectured by someone half his age about things she couldn't possibly understand. The gap between their generations had never seemed wider than in that moment. He said she had no idea what the world was like back then, what the pressures and expectations were. The other panelists tried desperately to intervene. They attempted to steer the conversation back to lighter topics. One suggested they take a quick break to reset the energy. Another tried to ask Michael about his upcoming projects and whether he had any new films in development. But Denise and Michael were locked in now, neither willing to back down from their positions. Denise said that age doesn't give anyone a free pass to avoid accountability for their words and actions. Michael shot back that accountability doesn't mean destroying someone's entire legacy over a few words taken out of context from 40 years ago. His hands gestured emphatically as he spoke, his frustration pouring out through his body language. The audience was split. Some people nodded in agreement with Denise, feeling she was asking important questions that needed answers. Others looked sympathetic to Michael's frustration, feeling he was being unfairly attacked. The cameras panned across the crowd, capturing their divided reactions. Social media was already exploding with clips from the interview, though nobody in the studio knew it yet. Hashtags were trending. People were taking sides. The tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Denise's tone became more aggressive. She leaned even further forward in her chair, invading Michael's personal space in a way that made him visibly uncomfortable. She asked why Michael was getting so defensive if he didn't think he had done anything wrong. She said innocent people don't react this way to simple questions. Michael's hands gripped the armrests of his chair so tightly his knuckles turned white. He said he wasn't defensive. He was frustrated at being ambushed on what was supposed to be a friendly chat show. He looked directly at Denise and said this felt more like a trial than an interview. His voice was loud enough that the audience in the back rows could hear him clearly without the microphone. He said he'd been in the industry long enough to recognize a setup when he saw one. Denise laughed dismissively. The laugh was cold and mocking, designed to belittle his concerns. She said if Michael couldn't handle a few tough questions, maybe he shouldn't be doing interviews at all. She suggested that perhaps he was too fragile for modern media. The audience gasped. Some people put their hands over their mouths in shock at the audacity of the comment. Michael's face went from red to almost purple. He said he had been handling tough questions since before Denise was born, appearing on every major talk show and news program in the world. But he said there's a difference between tough questions and a deliberate hatchet job. He accused her of having an agenda, of planning this confrontation from the moment he walked into the studio. He said she wanted to take down a legend, to make herself look brave and relevant. The argument escalated rapidly. Denise accused Michael of playing the victim, of using his legendary status to avoid responsibility for his past words and actions. She said powerful men always play the victim when they're finally held accountable. Michael accused Denise of trying to make a name for herself by attacking a respected figure. He said she was using him to create a viral moment, to get clicks and views at the expense of basic human decency and journalistic integrity. Their voices talked over each other, both trying to get their points across simultaneously. The producers in the control room were frantically signaling to cut to commercial. The floor manager was making slashing gestures across his throat, trying desperately to get someone's attention. The other panelists sat frozen, unsure how to stop what was happening right in front of them. One panelist actually stood up and tried to physically put her hand on Michael's shoulder to calm him down. He shrugged it off, though not roughly. He kept his eyes fixed on Denise. Another panelist was visibly upset, looking like she might cry from the stress of the situation unfolding. The makeup artist in the wings was shaking her head in disbelief. This was unprecedented in the show's history. They'd had disagreements before, but nothing like this. Then Denise made a comment about Michael's relevance in modern cinema. She suggested that maybe his time had passed, and that's why he was so bitter about the new generation of actors. She said perhaps he was jealous of younger talent getting the roles and recognition he used to enjoy. She implied that his anger was really about his own fading stardom. Michael stood up from his chair so quickly it rolled backward and nearly tipped over. His face was a mask of barely controlled fury. He pointed his finger at Denise and said that was the most disrespectful thing anyone had ever said to him on television, and he'd been doing television for longer than she'd been alive. He said he'd faced real criticism from real journalists and never lost his temper like this because they treated him with basic respect. Denise stood up too, matching his energy. She wasn't going to be intimidated by his reputation or his anger. She said if he couldn't take the heat, he should get out of the spotlight entirely. She told him that the world had moved on, and maybe he should too. She said clinging to past glory was sad to watch. Michael's voice boomed across the studio, so loud that people in the corridor outside could probably hear him. He said he had more talent in his little finger than she would have in her entire career. He said she was a talk show host trying to play journalist and failing miserably at both. He said real journalists know how to ask tough questions with dignity. Denise fired back that at least she knew how to have a conversation without throwing a tantrum like a child. She said his behavior right now was proving her point about his inability to handle criticism. She said he was demonstrating exactly the kind of entitled attitude she was questioning. Michael's eyes blazed with fury. He said the only thing being proven was her complete lack of professionalism and basic respect. He told her she should be ashamed of herself for treating any guest this way, let alone someone of his standing in the industry. He said the show used to have standards. The other panelists were now standing, trying to physically get between them. One grabbed Denise's arm and tried to pull her back. Another moved to stand beside Michael, creating a barrier between the two combatants. The audience was on their feet, some filming on their phones despite studio rules strictly against it. Security guards had appeared at the edges of the set, unsure whether they needed to intervene physically. The whole situation was spiraling completely out of control. The director in the control room was yelling into his headset, trying to figure out what to do. Michael's chest was heaving from the exertion and emotion. He looked at Denise with pure contempt. He said he had made a terrible mistake coming on this show, and that he should have known better than to expect professionalism from this particular program. He said he'd heard stories about the show's confrontational style, but had assumed they were exaggerated or misunderstood. Now he knew they weren't. Now he understood that the stories were completely accurate. He said this was an ambush, pure and simple, designed to humiliate him for entertainment value. He said it was cheap and disgusting. Denise crossed her arms defensively. She said that if anyone lacked professionalism, it was him for losing his temper on live television in front of millions of viewers. She said a real professional would be able to answer difficult questions without having a meltdown. She said his behavior was embarrassing to watch. Michael let out a bitter laugh. The laugh was harsh and cutting. He said he was losing his temper because he was being disrespected by someone who clearly had an agenda from the start. He accused her of setting him up, of planning this whole thing to create drama and get views and boost ratings. He said the questions weren't designed to inform or enlighten, they were designed to provoke and humiliate. Denise denied it completely. She raised her voice to match his volume. She said she was just asking the questions that the audience wanted answered, the questions that needed to be asked in today's climate. She said, someone had to hold people accountable, even legends, especially legends. She said the bigger the reputation, the more important the scrutiny. Michael shook his head vigorously. He said the audience wanted a good conversation, not a bloody interrogation. The swear word hung in the air. Several audience members gasped again. Children in the audience looked confused. Denise's eyes widened. She told him to watch his language and show some respect for the audience and the show and the broadcast standards. Michael said he would speak however he damn well pleased. He said if she wanted to talk about respect, perhaps she should start by respecting her guests instead of ambushing them with gotcha questions designed to make them look bad. He said real journalists ask tough questions with dignity, not with the goal of humiliation and viral clips. His voice was shaking with rage now, his usual composed demeanor completely shattered. Years of maintaining a professional image had crumbled in 2 minutes. He said this was the lowest point of his career in terms of how he'd been treated. The tension reached its breaking point. The air in the studio felt electric, like lightning was about to strike at any moment. Denise told Michael that if he was going to be rude and aggressive toward her and the other panelists, perhaps it would be best if he left the show immediately. Michael's eyebrows shot up in disbelief. He asked if she was actually kicking him off the show. He said he was a guest, invited here, and now she was throwing him out for defending himself against her attacks. He said the hypocrisy was stunning. Denise said she was giving him the option to leave with dignity before he embarrassed himself further in front of the viewers. Michael laughed harshly. The sound was bitter and angry. He said there was no dignity in this circus, that dignity had left the building the moment this interview started. He said the only embarrassment was the show itself and how it treated people who came here in good faith. He looked around at the other panelists and asked how they could sit there and let this happen to another human being. One of them looked away, unable to meet his eyes. Another stared at the floor. He ripped off his microphone, the wire tangling as he yanked it from his lapel with force. The sound technicians winced as the expensive equipment was roughly handled. The microphone pack fell to the floor with a thud. Michael didn't even look down at it. He looked at each of the panelists in turn, his expression a mixture of disappointment and anger. He told them they should be ashamed of themselves for sitting there and letting this happen. He said they were complicit in this ambush by their silence and inaction. He said they'd sold out their integrity for a paycheck. Then he turned back to Denise one final time. His final words were cutting and deliberate. He said that she had just made the biggest mistake of her career by treating a guest this way. He told her that people would remember this moment, and not in the way she hoped. He said she'd gotten her viral moment, but at what cost to her reputation? He predicted that this would backfire on her spectacularly. Denise tried to respond, tried to get the last word, but Michael held up his hand to stop her. The gesture was dismissive and final. He said he was done, that he wouldn't waste another second in this toxic environment. He called the whole setup a disgrace to television and to proper journalism. He said talk shows used to have standards and respect for their guests. Now they were just hunting for conflict and controversy at any cost. His voice was filled with genuine sadness beneath the anger, disappointed that it had come to this. He said the medium he'd worked in for decades had degraded into nothing more than gladiatorial combat for ratings. Michael turned and walked toward the exit with determined strides. The cameras followed him as he strode across the studio floor, capturing every step of his departure for posterity. His posture was rigid with anger, his shoulders squared. Behind him, Denise was trying to regain control of the show, her voice shaky as she attempted to address the audience. She tried to explain her position, to justify the confrontation and her line of questioning. The other panelists looked stunned, unsure what to do or say. One was dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. Another was staring at the table. The audience didn't know whether to applaud or remain silent. Most chose silence, watching the dramatic scene unfold before them. Some were still recording on their phones, determined to capture this historic moment. Others just stared in shock, unable to process what they were witnessing. This was not what anyone had expected when they came to watch a taping of Loose Women. They'd come for light entertainment, and instead witnessed one of the most explosive confrontations in talk show history. As Michael reached the studio door, he paused for just a moment. He looked back over his shoulder at the chaos he was leaving behind. His expression was unreadable, a complex mix of anger, disappointment, and vindication. Then, without another word, he pushed through the door forcefully. The heavy door swung shut behind him with a loud bang that echoed through the silent studio. The sound reverberated off the walls, a final punctuation mark on the explosive confrontation. The cameras cut back to the panel. Denise was sitting down again, her face flushed red with emotion. She tried to continue with the show, but her voice lacked its usual confidence. Her hands were shaking slightly as she picked up her notes. The papers rustled audibly. The other panelists exchanged worried glances, clearly disturbed by what had just happened. Nobody seemed to know what to say or how to proceed. The audience sat in stunned silence, processing what they had just witnessed. Some people were whispering to each other. Others sat motionless, unable to believe what they'd seen with their own eyes. The producers were scrambling backstage, dealing with the fallout of one of the most dramatic exits in talk show history. You could see people on headsets running around frantically in the background. The floor manager looked completely lost, holding his clipboard like it might provide answers. This was a situation nobody had planned for, nobody had expected. The carefully planned show had gone completely off the rails. In those final moments before they cut to commercial, you could see Denise's hands trembling slightly as she shuffled her papers repeatedly. She tried to make a joke to lighten the mood, but it fell completely flat. Nobody laughed. The weight of what had just happened was settling over everyone in the studio like a heavy blanket. Michael Caine, one of the most respected actors of his generation, had just stormed off the set of Loose Women after a confrontation that nobody saw coming. The studio door remained closed, Michael long gone into the corridor beyond, leaving behind a show in chaos and a host trying desperately to salvage what was left of the episode. The remaining panelists attempted to fill the time until the commercial break, but their words felt hollow and forced. Everyone knew that what had just happened would overshadow everything else about the show. This was the moment that would be replayed, discussed, and debated for years to come.